Recording in progress. Everybody turn to page 151 in your Bible. Look at the lower right-hand corner where it says, "The Lord's glory fills the tabernacle." Does everybody see that? What book and chapter are we in there? Now turn the page and look at the top left-hand corner. What book are we in there?
No.
Did we skip Leviticus? And I said that last week, and everyone y'all looked at me like I was crazy. We skipped a whole book of the Bible. Well, that's when I said last week, if you open a C.S. Lewis book, but you're reading the words from Curious George, you're kind of missing the whole point, thinking you're reading C.S. Lewis. Okay? We need to pay more attention to where we are in the book or what book we're in, because when we get to the New Testament, the way that they have done the Gospels, and I haven't been through enough of the Old Testament yet. I like to read to the end, and but they've taken all the accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If they all four have that account, they put them all on the same page. Y'all think it's confusing now, skipping a whole book? Why do we get to skip it into 3 and 4 books at a time?
If you go to page 151, it picks up with Leviticus on page 151. 157, I'm sorry, 157. I'm looking at it.
Okay, but in the turn of a page, we skipped a whole book.
Yep.
And that's the point. That's
Gotcha.
the point. We've got to pay attention where we're reading and what we're reading, or it's not going to do us any good.
Well, it's a timeline.
And they did it like this, but to put it in what they're calling chronological order. It's a chronological study Bible. It follows a timeline. Does that make sense to everybody? Because it's true. We have already read forward to Chronicles back when we were reading about Abraham. And we weren't paying attention then either, because I pointed it out then, and I'm pointing it out again now. Now, something was said to me earlier. We're reading here, but when we come on Wednesday night, we're still covering back there. After tonight, I will catch up. We'll skip up. And with tomorrow's reading, that's what we'll talk about next Wednesday. Does everybody kind of go along with that? That way we're talking about what's current, what we're looking at in the Bible. So that means what we've read, we're not going to discuss or talk about. Okay, I hope y'all got it. Y'all know at the end there is a test. Not from me. I'm not giving the test. And it's not me giving the test. It's somebody with way more power and authority than me. So let me find where we are. Oh, should be, because I shifted the pages. Page 162. Questions from page 162. Mm. Mm. And the question is, why does God give such a detail for the different types of offering And what does this teach us about God? February 18th.
Rich is different from the poor. They have different offerings.
The rich is different from the poor. They have different offerings, but you have a sin offering. You have the Day of Atonement offering. You've got a coin offering. You've got a drink offering. You've got the flour offering, which would be grain, bread. The olive oil.
If we look at it in the context of he's building a new kingdom and their babies. I think each one of these offerings brings every aspect of things that have happened to them up front so that they're more aware. And things don't get washed down as they're growing as a community. Kingdom. It brings importance to their everyday life. It keeps them important in their everyday life.
Isn't the first question there?
It's the second one.
That's the second one, because we talked about why do the sins of the leaders and the high priest. We talked about that one last week.
Oh, okay.
So we've moved to the second question. The detail offering on the different types of the offerings, and what does this teach us about God? So everything you said sounded good. It is a nation in their infancy. They need to learn how important these things are. But I think God was so particular about the different atonements for the different sins because sin was so devastating. And I said this last week. I think I said it the time we gathered before. We don't look at the devastation of sin nearly as much as we should. Sin separates us from God. Sin separates us from our community, and sin separates us from each other. Look at Adam and Eve when God walked up to them and said, I can't believe you've done this thing. Eve points at the snake. Adam points at the woman and back at God. Then they get kicked out of the garden. They were separated from their community. They were separated from their God, and they were separated from each other because they sinned. And we don't see sin like that. God is bringing this nation in their infancy, and he is bringing to their attention everything you grow, the first everything belongs to him because he gave it to you in the first place. And then when you sin, you've got to give up even more. I don't know anything about raising cattle. I don't know anything about goats, none of that. But I'm assuming it's pretty hard to raise a goat or a bull or a cow. That's why beef is so expensive. But the grain offering, they didn't have $1 million combines back then. They had a stick that they were scratching at the ground with, and they were going to have to give their life savings to buy the seed to plant. So every stalk of wheat that came out of the ground for one of these farmers meant something. And later on, Josephus, not to be confused with Bocephus, which I have done before. Josephus actually writes about a farmer that had about an acre of wheat, and he lit it on fire because the Romans were going to take it anyway, and him and his family were going to starve. So he lit it on fire just to keep the Romans from getting it. Anyway, all this stuff was hard to do. They couldn't just run to Walmart and pick up incense and wheat and olive oil and a gallon of wine or any of this stuff. They had to make it for themselves. And particularly while they're having their wilderness experience, it's probably good that we pay attention to that, because when are they going to grow wheat?
I remember reading about them talking about the manna, you know, they were just all this manna and keep feeding for kind of like they're tired of it, you know. We don't-
Yeah, now they explode on Moses and tell him we're sick of it. It's disgusting. Yeah. But sin was so bad that it demanded a sacrifice of a live animal, a life for a life. And what you did was a sin before God. You've got to be the one to go kill this animal. That animal gave you its life because God required a life. The words substitutionary atonement started way back then, or even the bigger word, propitiation, which is the same thing as a substitutionary atonement. We live under the greatest substitutionary atonement ever, Jesus. Right? And whenever anybody asks you, why aren't there dragons in the Bible? Why aren't there dinosaurs in the Bible? That's not what the Bible is about. Okay? Because when people come at me and ask that, I always look at them and say, why aren't kitty cats in the Bible? Are you going to deny they're in existence too? The Bible is not about any of that stuff. The Bible is about God's actions on mankind and what it took for God to bring about Messiah. And once you get through the Gospels, it's kind of the now what? Now what do? We build the church and we continue to spread the message. But even here in the earlier parts of Moses's writings, we can find things that still point straight to Jesus. And the substitutionary atonement is at the top of the list. That's got to be there. Anybody else want to say anything? I can see it in your eyes. Preacher, please shut up.
You referenced farming in that fire in Texas. Not only brakes, combines, tractors, the granaries, it burned the electric wires into the pumps that can't water the cattle. And one farmer that we heard of almost 400 head of cows.
Gosh.
I mean, those people are devastated.
Yeah, yeah. So what does all this teach us about God?
That's first.
The God should always come first. And what about God's standards for us? See, and what's the problem with God having such a high standard? Only one has ever been able to meet him. And look what we did to him. So, all of these laws and everything, all the perfection, the high standard that God set for us, should have brought everyone in history, everybody that ever read and understood any part of this, should have brought them to the point where they said, I can't do it. And God would have said, no, you can't, but I can do it for you. And that's what we rely on. That's what we've come to. Paul, in fact, says that the law does nothing but condemn. But in Christ, we find redemption. And the law just points us to Christ. So on page 161, why must the fire never go out?
Oh, no, not well.
Constantly. Presence.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. I see a smart aleck. I see a smart aleck brewing. Say it. Go ahead and say it.
They didn't have one. They did that.
I thought the smart aleck was going to be because God said, don't let it go out. Oh, I didn't.
It's a constant reminder of God's presence.
It was a constant reminder of God's presence, but he also said right over here, it must never go out.
It says
So basically the answer is because God said so. Don't let it out because God said so. But yeah, it was a constant reminder. And this was the fire that the priest would carry the slaughtered animals in and lay body parts on. God's ceremonial sacrifice for the forgiveness, you had to take your own animal. Anyway, that's what can this daily attentiveness teach us about our approach to meeting with the Lord through prayer and the study of his word? Don't let the fire in our hearts burn out. We should do it daily. Get a little bit done at a time. That way it's not like trying to eat an elephant at one meal.
You know, pastors on hang on me, but sure that we remember that. Oh, yes.
Aren't you glad you're not Jewish? I wake up when Madra cooks the bacon and I think, thank you, God, I'm not Jewish. And now remember, the law applied to the Jews and the foreigner living with them. Who's ready to move to Israel? Not now, that's right. If you do a little bit every day, you won't have to do that much at one time. You just keep the fire burning, as in the fresh wood, and you'd be able to take on a little bit at a time instead of burning it all up at once. Now, the question's on page 165. How does the Lord use the various offerings to provide for the priests and their families? Remember, the priests were not going to be allotted any property.
They were given some of the animals that were
Correct.
sacrificed. Further, I guess.
Look over on page 163, the portion for the priests, Leviticus 7:28 through 38. God said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people. Let me skip down. I have reserved the breast of the special offering, the right thigh of, okay, down to 34. For I have reserved the breast of the special offering, the right thigh of the sacred offering for the priests. It is the permanent right for Aaron and his descendants to share in the peace offerings brought by the people of Israel. This is their rightful share. The special gifts presented to the Lord have been reserved for Aaron and his descendants from the time they were set apart to serve the Lord as priests. In other words, because God said so. Right? I look at some of this stuff and it's like, why does this happen? Because God said for it to. Who are we? And this is where I kind of go back to my roots. My mother was Southern Baptist. You don't get to question God. I do. I kind of push the line sometimes, I think. But my mom was like, and my grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher. And his thing was, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that's it. And I kind of go along with that. So this why do we really get to ask why? But the priests had a section set aside for them because that was the only portion they were going to get. They weren't to own land, they weren't to work, they weren't to do this, they weren't to. I mean, you go down the laundry list of everything the priests couldn't do, and it's easier to make a list of what they could do. God had to take care of them somehow. They had to eat something. They had to feed their families. We're going to get into some of the particulars in a minute. Here we go. Why does God set limits on eating from the offerings? So in 7:1-38, God lays out all the instructions for the offering. He lays out everything that's supposed to be given to the priests as their portion. We just covered that, right? But if you read in chapter 7, verse 15, where is 15? Right after 14. Hey, it's right where these purple lines are, because I underlined it. So the meat of the peace offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the same day it was offered. None of the meat may be saved for the next morning. Now I want you to kind of broaden your minds a little bit. Okay. You got 4 or 5 families that are coming to the tabernacle and they're offering a peace offering. God said the right thigh. And what else? And the breast. Okay. So you got 6 families. So you got 6 right thighs and 6 breasts from a goat or a lamb or a sheep. I don't know how big those animals are, but I bet the 2 of y'all couldn't eat all that meat. So what would a priest have to do to avoid leaving the meat for tomorrow morning? Call the other priests.
And their family.
See, this to me is what we miss, particularly in the 21st century. We run to Walmart and we buy a steak and we come home and we cook it in our kitchen. Y'all just leave me alone. But back then, when you killed a cow, how long is that meat going to last?
Not long.
Not long at all. So how many of you and your friends is it going to take to eat all of this cow before it goes bad? And that's what they did. They brought the community together and everybody ate. And think about the wisdom of God saying, don't leave any of the meat till morning. God's not asking you to get your friends together. God is telling you to get your friends together and finish this meal before tomorrow. Even at the Passover, God said, eat the lamb among your family. If your family isn't big enough, bring in some of your neighbors. See, God spent 400 years in Egypt building families. right? Because the family was God's first institution, Adam and Eve. 400 years in Egypt, slavery, all that did was bring the families even closer together. Now God's leading the nation through 40 years in the wilderness in their infancy, and he's child-proofing the wilderness for the Israelites.
There's probably 8,000 of them at the time.
Oh, no.
No more than that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It doesn't sense when he told, I mean, there was.
Yeah, and there's like 60 or 70,000 men fighting age, 20 to 50. That's not counting the women and the kids and what they would consider elderly. We don't consider elderly, we don't consider 50 elderly anymore. Thank God. Although I walk like it sometimes, don't I? So yeah, there were thousands of them, millions of Israelites together, but just the priests or the Levite family, 60, 70,000 each,
In tents and separate little communities in a way.
right? North, south, east, and west of the tabernacle, under their own flag, and that's where they slept. Why was it important for the priests to be made holy through the process of ordination? Because God said so. Yes, ma'am. But there was another reason.
Well, I'm not going to hear that talking about.
Because the priests had to work in and around the tabernacle, and they had to be holy. They had to be, everything they have done today was commanded by the Lord in order to purify you, making you right with God. We are not right with God on our own. It takes great sacrifice and special care to be made right with God. Further, only God can make us right with God. We cannot do that on our own. So this ordination process, consecration process that they went through had to be done because God said so, one. But they had to be made right with God so they could work in and around the tabernacle. Unfortunately, Aaron's two sons didn't listen, did they? Now, what does this teach us about our holy God? Very particular, very high standard, very particular. But God, God had plans for the nation of Israel. They were to be a nation of priests. They were to minister to the rest of the world.
He provided avenues for them to reach all of these things.
Right. But you couldn't reach them all at once. And that's the downfall. But God wanted them to be holy, set aside for him. Not just the priests, not just the Levites, but the whole nation. God wanted them set aside. And that's why he had such high standards for them. So on page 168, how does the Lord show his acceptance of Aaron's offering that was presented at the altar and his blessing on the people? And what is the significance of this acceptance?
First seven, then bottom, the first column.
What page are you on? No, you're not. Let me get over there. Number 7 on the first page at the bottom. Then Moses said to Aaron, come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering to purify yourself and the people. Then present the offering to purify them, making them right with the Lord, just as he has commanded. In that section, you're not wrong. But in that section, God has told Moses how the sacrifice for the Day of Atonement would go. On this page, the action starts. Okay? And if you look at the bottom of page 166, not the bottom, but about 2/3 of the way down, the sin of Nadab and Abihu. They go into the temple, they had the wrong fire, and they had been drinking. These are Aaron's sons. And after that, Moses goes over to Aaron and says, look at verse 3 right there. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is what the Lord meant when he said, I will display my holiness through those who come near me. I will display my glory before all the people. Think about the mindset that Aaron is in right now. This wonderful, holy God that I'm trying to serve has just killed my 2 oldest sons. Think about the attitude he has. And then if you keep reading further, Moses says to Aaron and his other 2 sons, don't show grief by leaving your hair uncombed or by tearing your clothes. If you do, you will die. So how would you feel having to go into a place that you knew your sin would get you killed for going in there if you didn't have the purification process down quite right, and you didn't build your fire quite right, and your 2 sons have just been killed? So how does God show his acceptance of Aaron's offerings right there? Isn't there another one that happens afterwards? Ceremonially clean and unclean animals. So the sons died after Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle. They came back out and they blessed the people again. Glory of the Lord blazed forth in the presence, consumed the burnt offering and the fat. The people saw this and they shouted and they fell face down on the ground. So yeah, that may have happened before. I maybe I got it all confused. Okay. Next question. How does God reinforce the holiness of the tabernacle, and what lessons do his actions teach his people and us?
He means what he says.
Y'all are right. I got the wrong. Leviticus 9:23, page 166. If God had not accepted Aaron's offerings, he would have died. But he and Moses went. He would have died when he and Moses went into the tabernacle. This was an important time for Israel. It was the first sacrifices that Aaron and his sons had performed as priests. From my notes.
That first offering. I think you're right, I think it's kind of got them here, and then when they went in to get the first offering, the 2 brothers, they dropped and they died. And then your question of how would Aaron feel knowing that he's got to go in there and manage. And I think that's where it picks up with the instructions for the priestly conduct.
Yes.
Aaron had to make a choice right then to be godlike or not.
And see, at the first of the instructions, look who's talking. And look who he's talking to. Who's God normally been talking to? And so God kind of brings him over and cools him off a little bit. So how does God reinforce the holiness of the tabernacle, and what lessons do these actions teach his people and us? Obviously, we already talked about Aaron's sons dying. But in Leviticus 10:2, we read that fire blazed forth from the Lord and burned them up, and they died. They died there before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron what I already quoted. God's not trifling with those people that are working in the tabernacle. And God's not trifling with us either. This is no small matter of sin and getting things wrong.
But if you go back to what you were saying before, part of it was an atonement. And it was almost like that atonement for these two boys was their life. Yes, I mean, they had to give a big sacrifice. Aaron had to, in a way, give a big sacrifice to worship God. They gave their life. Now,
Yes.
their fault that most of our sins are.
Yes, they are.
If you were next in the line and you'd be working in around the tabernacle, once you know, you would be sure to do it right.
Yeah, and you wouldn't just run in there handy slammy, would you?
Okay, I'm next in line.
That's right.
Exactly what God told me.
That's right. Yes. So yeah, all the above. I have no arguments with any of that. Why does God give instructions about clean and unclean animals? Because he wanted to.
Oh, goodness. Hey, what? If we should accept them, I put a big old question mark.
So in Leviticus 11, God tells the people the clean and unclean animals. God uses the word detestable 8 times. I didn't know that was going to come up as a question later on, how many times detestable gets used. Or there's another word coming up in a minute. God's intent can honestly not be known, cannot honestly be known. However, if one were to eat the way God's law says to, then one would be healthier than if eating McDonald's. I mean, think about it. It's a very healthy diet. God wanted the Hebrew Israelite people to be set aside and to be holy to him and him alone. God set their diet just like God set most of their actions. But I still don't have a wine. I don't. And I'm up on my reading. I do not have a wine. God gave us clean and unclean animals. Why does God call the people to consecrate themselves and to be holy? To set them apart, right? Consecrated to God for God's service and to live a life in God. How does the uncleanness of childbirth help teach the difference between sin and the concept of uncleanness?
Well, we talked about blood is life, so. Something to do with blood.
It's got a lot to do with the blood, but on sort of a broader scale, having a baby is not a sin. Let's get that on the table right now. Having a baby is not a sin. We want to walk out of here tonight, don't we? Um, but the time of purification will also give a woman's body time to rest and recover from having a baby. And God kind of made this law to say, hey, you husbands need to step back a little bit. Leave her alone. Let her recover. And see, this would be the uncleanness. The sin stuff would be different. And God's making that pretty clear when it comes to the childbirth.
He also talks about if you took the dead body, if you're unclean, you must get to wash yourself and your clothes, and you're unclean for.
I actually want to get to that in our remaining 10 minutes. Do y'all want me to skip ahead and get to that? Because we can skip ahead and get to that right now. So let's take a look on page 211.
Supposed to speak to the rock.
Well, now, are we going to jump forward and talk about this? Or are we going to go back and talk about Moses hitting the rock? I got to know. I can't do both. I can't do them both. So here's another legal requirement: blood to transfer the fingers. Then the priests have got to wash their clothes outside the camp. All right, here we go. Verse 11, page 211, Numbers 19 is the chapter, and it's going to be starting with verse 11. And for those that are on the computer part, it's March 5th. To those who touch a dead human body will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. They must purify themselves on the 3rd and the 7th days with the water of purification. Let me stop right there, because the water of purification, they had to burn a red heifer with no flaws and nothing wrong. And they had to, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. They had to burn the heifer, a piece of cypress wood, a hyssop branch, and a piece of red thread. And when all that burned down, the priest was supposed to go wash his clothes, and he was ceremonially unclean till dark. Somebody was supposed to come scoop up all the ashes, put them somewhere outside the camp and store them, because those are the ashes for the purification. But the dude that carried the ashes out there had to wash his clothes and bathe, and he was ceremonially unclean till that night. So this purification, you had to go out and you had to get a hyssop branch, you had to have fresh water, and you had to take some ashes from this heifer that had been burned, and you had to dip the hyssop branch in there and sprinkle. Somebody else had to do it to you, somebody that was ceremonially clean. We might get to that. Then, okay, so use the water purification, then they will be purified. You get that? So they do it on the 3rd and the 7th day with the water purification, then they will be purified. But if they don't do this on the 3rd and 7th days, they will continue to be unclean even after the 7th day. All those who touch a dead body and do not purify themselves in the proper way defile the Lord's tabernacle, and they will be cut off from the community of Israel. Since the water of purification is not sprinkled on them, their defilement continues.
If they got one chance to do this, and if they don't do it on the 2nd and 7th.
3rd and 7th.
third, they-
Well, I'm thinking you just try again next week,
well, they don't
because you
say-
can't do nothing on the Sabbath,
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
But now, jump forward about 4,000 years and look at their burial process and look at Jesus. Let's just take the one we can describe the best. It took Nicodemus, and who was the other one that took Jesus off the cross, that went in and pleaded for Jesus's body? Madra, who was that guy? No, it wasn't Atticus. He was a Jew.
Joseph of Arimathea,
Joseph of Arimathea. Thank you, Madra.
welcome.
When I say to y'all she's smarter than I am, there's your proof. So you got those two men that are wrestling him down off the cross. You got his mother, and there were two other Marys there. So there's 5 people that are ceremonially unclean from touching Jesus. Then early the morning, the 3 Marys go up and they're carrying spices. They were going to be ceremonially unclean. What I'm trying to say is look at the sacrifice that these people were willing to go through just to help take care of Jesus's body. They knew what touching a body would involve, and they were willing to go on and do it anyway. I find it amazing, and I'm loving this that we don't know a lot of this stuff that's back here. Let me just make a kind of a blanket statement, just to save you from asking a question like that again. I don't ever watch the news. Somebody emailed me some news the other day, and a retired United Methodist district superintendent was caught on a Ring camera walking past a lady. She had her groceries delivered, and he stopped and he pulled out a pen and he drew a swastika on top, and she was Jewish. So, but that's the only news. So email it to, you want me to see it, email it to me. Well, the temple was torn down in 70 AD, so they haven't been making sacrifices since then, because all they were left with was the Wailing, the Western Wall. So yeah, I don't doubt that people are trying to help them out. Now, also, if they touched a grave, let me do the defilement. Okay, page 212 on the next page. It goes through if somebody dies in a tent and the tent needs to be cleaned out, jump down there to 17. To remove the defilement, put some of the ashes on the burnt purification offering jar and pour fresh water on them. Then someone who is ceremonially clean must take a hyssop branch and dip it into the water. That person must sprinkle the water on the tent, on all the furnishings, on the furnishings in the tent, and on the people who were in the tent. Also, the person who touched the human bone, or touched someone who was killed or died naturally, or touched a grave. You had to go through all that if you touched a grave. So now, with Sunday's sermon and Jesus telling the Pharisees, he flipped the tables. Remember, that was Sunday's sermon. And the Jewish leaders come up on Jesus and they say, we need a sign from you to show that God gave you the authority to do this. And Jesus said, tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And John kind of comes in there and gives us a footnote. Jesus isn't talking about the temple they were standing in. He was talking about the temple of his body. Look right there at Numbers 19:20. Those who become defiled and do not purify themselves will be cut off from the community, for they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. Now, it's not tabernacle,
Sanctuary.
it's sanctuary. It's the body. It's each of the bodies. It's each individual person. I've often said Jesus didn't reinvent the wheel. When he was tempted by Satan out in the wilderness, what was he quoting back to the devil? All Old Testament text. He didn't have to dream up anything new. And right here, we have God telling Moses that if these people don't purify themselves, they are to be cut off from the community because they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord.
Hey, I'm wondering, you know, you see, you're about, like, it's a mass murder, they're living in the house for about 4 or 5 days. And when they go in, they're in these asbestos suits, this zip-up suit. And they say they go in there because of the disease, or they get sick if they're around dead bodies. But you know what? You see roadkill, you walk by and see something dead on the side of the road. It don't get you sick, walk by, but they say they around a dead person, I guess, will, but they all got that zip-up, asbestos suit.
Rotting flesh will make you sick.
Yeah.
Rotting flesh will make you sick. Right. It could be a drug lab. They have no idea what they're getting into. But yeah, a rotting body will make you sick.
Maybe that's why, you don't need to touch it.
Right. I think God pretty much laid down some logical laws. He really did. Aaron?
They, all the body, and touching the drugs and all that, they, how does that relate to us now? What's that? Between that and between that, what does that do for us?
I would say it doesn't do anything for us now. Because we don't have to worry about a ceremonially clean state anymore. And I've Bob Stamps, one of my favorite seminary professors, Madra has probably heard his name 1,000 times. What he said to us was Jesus came and lived a normal life, not to profane what was holy, but to make holy what we consider profane. And like when I was a kid growing up, my mom would catch kids running through the sanctuary and she'd be like, y'all slow down. Go to the fellowship hall if you want to run. And it's like, isn't it the same building? It's just right there. So what's the difference in the kids running through the sanctuary and running through the fellowship hall? Why do we hold the sanctuary as a more holy place than the fellowship hall?
The altar is in there.
But we really don't call that an altar because we don't kill anything on it. And so the level of holiness has changed because instead of just being simple and profane anymore, we've been elevated to holy. And Peter repeats God's command that you are to be a nation of priests, holy and set apart for God. And how many of y'all have been watched by a little kid caught doing something good, caught doing something bad, one way or the other? See what I'm saying? Were you setting a good example for that kid at the time that kid was watching you? Because I got news for you. Somebody is always watching.
Word is forgiveness. That God no gives us forgiveness. But is it not us?
No, communion is more representative of Passover and it's a channel of God's grace to us. I say more representative of Passover because we receive the blood of the lamb and the body. But it's God's grace channeled into us. John Calvin, and this will get really complicated really quickly, but it's not that complicated. John Calvin wrote that when we take communion, our souls are transported to heaven through the power of the Holy Spirit, and we worship God standing next to Jesus. Does that change the way maybe you see communion? Because see, when John Calvin was alive, you had Martin Luther, you had Zwingli, and I can never remember Zwingli's first name, but there were four ideas of communion, and all the writing, and well, the majority of the writing, again, Bob Stamps went to Germany and went to Martin Luther library and John Calvin's library, and his statement. In both libraries, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages written about what happens to the stuff. But there's less than 100 written about what happens to us during communion. And don't we as humans get hung up on the stuff too much instead of being hung up on what really matters, and that's the people? So John Calvin wrote that our souls are transported to heaven, and 200 years later, when John Wesley was alive, John Wesley wrote that we are only a hair's breadth away from John Calvin when it comes to communion. So,
Back to Eric's, I just want to answer. Well, I was thinking in there on the ceremonies here, and that we just studied on the dead bodies. How does it stand now, you see? But that Christ took care of it. He took care of the ceremony.
ooh,
Am I that wrong?
remember Jesus's words at the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't come to abolish the law, but fulfill it.
But he has fulfilled.
So be careful when we get in here, because we have two choices. We can live under Moses' Old Testament law, or we can live under the law of grace that Jesus provided for us. Me too. And everybody I know.
Well, now Romans, we did study Romans, and Romans said that the Jews will have to accept the grace of God.
Yeah, they will. And at some point,
And they can't live on their ancestors' faith.
and at some point, they're going to have to look at that law and they're going to have to say, this has been trying to point me to Jesus all along.
Jesus' death, the purposed. So that made it accessible. Like, that center. That tabernacle.
The Holy of Holies, which was in the temple. See, by the time Jesus came, it was an actual building and it was a solid rock wall. And like, depending on who you listen to, people will say, God broke that coming out. Well, I kind of like the idea God broke that so I could get in.
Right, right, that's what I see when I hear that purpose form, is we could all enter the foreigners and the nation.
And I've not preached an Easter sermon for you. Nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus walked out of the grave, out of the tomb. The stone wasn't rolled away to let Jesus out. The stone was rolled away to let me and you in. Same principle as the temple.
The law was not to be replaced.
Correct.
Jesus' life in this day.
The law is still there to point us to Jesus, to bring us to the point that we put our hands and say, God, I can't do it. And that's when God says, you're right, I already did it for you. Now look at Jesus. It's nice and quiet back there at that table. Y'all forgot they were even back there, didn't you? Does anybody else have any questions? So now next week, we will start with the readings from March the 7th. Right? That's tomorrow. Today's the 6th.
Because I'm like saying, I was a little bit confused half the time. But the other half the time, I was a lot confused. Because I was reading one day and studying something else, and this makes it a little easier.
I hope you're reading part of it, when Moses and Aaron did go up on the mountain, God called them up there. Spoke to the kids, Robert.
Time out before you put your Bibles up. I got another question I want to ask. I'm sorry, Stan. Go ahead, say that again.
Moses and Aaron's son went up on the mountain, God called them up there, said, well, 3 of y'all come up, 2 of y'all gonna come back. What happened to Aaron's body? Was he just left on the God was taking him?
I don't know.
I don't remember reading about that part.
Y'all look on page 213. This won't take 2 minutes, I promise. On page 213, about halfway down the page, it says victory over the Canaanites. Read the first verse. Does that sound like what happened back in October? The Israelites been fighting them people for a long time. Long time.
Still waiting.
Well,
No, you don't need some news.
no, I tell you, I've been getting these, I watch YouTube videos, Adrian Rogers and Billy Graham, stuff like that. I get these little commercials that'll pop up and it's this guy sitting there with his daughter and she wants to know why we had to move and blah, blah, blah. And then like it comes up and it says, help support Gaza. No,
Well, I feel well.
I don't understand why they feel that God, what God said.
I'm gonna cut this off. I love y'all. Have a good night.
Yourself, I blame Israel for what they're doing. The